The Bridgewater Triangle in southeastern Massachusetts is not a place you'll find on any official map, but it has long been whispered about in hushed tones among locals. Encompassing roughly 200 square miles, this eerie area includes towns like Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown, with the Hockomock Swamp at its heart. The name Hockomock comes from the Wampanoag, and it translates to place where spirits dwell. The swamp itself feels like it hasn't changed in centuries, with its dark waters and ancient towering trees, but over the years its reputation has become darker, entwined with stories of disappearances, UFO sightings, and strange creatures lurking in the mist. The legend of the Bridgewater Triangle is built on a foundation of strange occurrences stretching back centuries. In the 1600s, during King Philip's War, the swamp became a battlefield, a place where both Native American warriors and settlers fought viciously. It's said that the bloodshed left the land cursed. Those who venture into the heart of the triangle feel the weight of this history, as if the spirits of those who died violently still wander the murky waters and mist-shrouded woods. In more recent times, however, the triangle has become infamous for a series of disappearances. In the 1970s, at least 2 high-profile cases drew national attention, but there have been countless smaller incidents that don't make the headlines. The locals know better than to linger near the swamp at dusk, and many families pass down tales of missing relatives or terrifying encounters with the unknown. One of the most unsettling cases occurred in May 1978, when 17-year-old Sandra Howe went missing while hiking near the Hockomock Swamp. Sandra was a local high school student from Easton, Massachusetts, and by all accounts she was an outdoorsy, independent young woman who loved to explore the forests and swamps near her hometown. She had grown up hearing stories about the triangle, but she never believed them until she became part of one. On the morning of May 14, 1978, Sandra left her house with a backpack and told her parents she was going for a hike with her dog, Max. Her family thought nothing of it at the time. Sandra had taken this trail dozens of times before. But when she didn't return by evening, her parents grew concerned. They found her car parked at the entrance to one of the less-used trails leading into the swamp, but Sandra and her dog were nowhere to be found. A search party was formed immediately. For days, dozens of volunteers, state police, and even professional trackers combed through the area, but they found no trace of Sandra or Max. On the 3rd day, the dog was found about 2 miles from where Sandra had disappeared, wandering aimlessly and covered in mud. But Max's behavior was strange. He seemed skittish, nervous, and kept growling at the thickest parts of the forest. Rescue teams noted that the dog refused to lead them anywhere, acting as if something out there terrified him beyond reason. Sandra, however, was never found. The only clue was a shoe, her right sneaker, discovered deep in the swamp, half buried in the mud. Investigators could never determine what had happened to her, and the case was eventually classified as an unsolved disappearance. But locals knew better. Sandra had been claimed by the triangle. Just 2 years later, another incident occurred that further solidified the area's dark reputation. In October 1980, 32-year-old Carl Houston, a construction worker from Brockton, Massachusetts, disappeared under equally bizarre circumstances. Carl was a skeptic when it came to the stories of ghosts and monsters in the triangle. He often laughed at the superstitions of his neighbors and took pride in mocking their fears. On October 5th, Carl had been out with friends in Abington, enjoying a few drinks at a local bar. He left just after midnight, telling his friends he'd take the long way home through the old Bridgewater roads, cutting through the edge of the swamp. He'd done this many times before without incident. That night, however, Carl never made it home. The next morning, Carl's pickup truck was found abandoned along a desolate stretch of Elm Street, a road that skirts the northeastern edge of the triangle. The engine was still running, and the driver's door was ajar. His friends assumed he had broken down or wandered off in a drunken stupor, but after hours of searching the surrounding area, they came up empty-handed. His truck was in perfect condition, no signs of mechanical failure or a struggle. In the weeks following Carl's disappearance, several people reported strange sightings near the spot where his truck had been found. A local farmer claimed to have seen strange, hovering lights over the swamp on the night Carl vanished. Another man, who had been out driving late, reported seeing a figure dart across the road in front of him, only to disappear into the fog. Authorities never substantiated these claims, dismissing them as folklore. But Carl's case remains unsolved to this day. By 1983, the Bridgewater Triangle was infamous, not just for disappearances but for a string of paranormal events that haunted the area throughout the early 1980s. Reports of shadowy figures, disembodied voices, and strange creatures were becoming more common. In January of that year, residents in the town of Rehoboth began to experience strange noises at night, low, rumbling sounds that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. Some described it as a growl, others as the deep hum of something mechanical, though no equipment or machinery was ever found nearby. A group of college students, intrigued by the growing legend, decided to investigate the area themselves. On March 12, 1983, they ventured into the Triangle, armed with tape recorders and flashlights. What they captured that night has been the subject of debate ever since. Around midnight, the tape recorder picked up a series of guttural growls, followed by what sounded like footsteps, moving unnaturally fast through the woods. The students, terrified, ran back to their car. But when they played the tape later, they discovered something else, a voice, faint and distorted, whispering, "It's here." They never returned to the Triangle, and 2 of the students dropped out of college shortly afterward, claiming to have been haunted by nightmares ever since. In addition to the paranormal activity, there have been numerous sightings of strange creatures in the Bridgewater Triangle. Perhaps the most famous is the thunderbird, a massive bird-like creature with a wingspan of at least 12 feet. The first reported sighting dates back to 1971, when several witnesses claimed to have seen the bird circling over the swamp. In 1985, 2 hunters reported seeing the creature again, describing it as prehistoric and resembling a pterodactyl. Other sightings have included massive, wolf-like creatures with glowing red eyes, as well as phantom dogs, believed by some to be manifestations of the spirits of long-dead pets or something much darker. Hikers in the Freetown Fall River State Forest, another hotspot within the Triangle, have also reported encountering strange humanoid figures that seem to vanish into the trees. Despite the passage of time, the Bridgewater Triangle remains an unsettling mystery. Locals continue to report strange occurrences in the area, and while some attribute the disappearances to natural dangers, getting lost in the dense woods or drowning in the swamp, others are convinced something more sinister is at play. In 2020, a man named Peter Wilkins claimed to have had a terrifying encounter while walking his dog near the edge of the Triangle. Just before dusk, Peter noticed the forest around him had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects completely absent. Then, from deep within the swamp, he heard a low growl. He looked up to see a pair of glowing red eyes staring at him through the fog. Panicked, Peter ran, not stopping until he reached the safety of his car. To this day, he refuses to go near the swamp after dark. Though some dismiss the stories of the Bridgewater Triangle as local legend or hysteria, there is no denying the pattern of fear and disappearance that haunts this strange area. The Triangle, it seems, is a place where the normal rules of reality break down, where the past bleeds into the present, and where something dark, something ancient lurks just beneath the surface waiting. The disappearances, the UFO sightings, the ghostly apparitions, and the strange creatures all point to a place that defies explanation. While the truth of the Bridgewater Triangle may never be fully understood, one thing is certain for those who dare to enter: the danger is real, and many never return. This is the story of Ranger Tom Grady of the Bridgewater Triangle region. The Bridgewater Triangle is no ordinary place. It's an area filled with ancient history, where the lines between the natural and supernatural seem to blur. People disappear here. People hear things, whispers, footsteps in the fog. Strange lights flicker above the trees. The locals say it's the spirits of the Wampanoag, but those of us who patrol these woods know better. At least I thought I did. It's been over 40 years now, but I remember that day like it was yesterday, May 14th, 1978. The case of Sandra Howe still sends chills down my spine. I've been working as a park ranger in this region for nearly 50 years, and nothing has ever come close to what happened that spring. Sandra was a local girl from Easton, just 17 at the time. I'd seen her around the trails before, bright kid, always smiling, always with her dog, Max. She loved the outdoors. It wasn't unusual to see her hiking the paths around Hockomock Swamp. She wasn't the type to get lost or scared, and I think that's what made what happened all the more terrifying. That morning, Sandra told her parents she was going out for a hike with Max like she always did. Her mom later told me that she seemed happy, nothing out of the ordinary. She drove her car to the same spot she always parked at, just off Prospect Hill Road, near the edge of the swamp. A quiet area. Too quiet. I was doing my usual rounds when the call came in that night. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids her age sometimes wandered off, maybe got a little turned around, but they always showed up. We sent out a small search party that first night, just a few local volunteers and another ranger. We combed the area near her car. Her parents had found it there, parked neatly at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition. The sun had already set, and a thick mist was rolling in from the swamp. I remember how uneasy I felt when we entered the woods. Hockomock Swamp is eerie on a good day. There's something about the place that's heavy, like the air presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. The locals have always called it the place where spirits dwell. I didn't put much stock in those stories back then. I figured it was just another stretch of wilderness. But that night, something felt different. We didn't find anything, but as we walked deeper into the swamp, I could swear I heard something, a low hum, almost like chanting, but distant, like it was coming from deep beneath the ground. By midnight, we called off the search. I didn't sleep much that night. Something about the way Max, Sandra's dog, had been acting stuck with me. He was found wandering about a mile away the next morning. Normally a happy, energetic dog, Max was trembling, covered in muck, and he kept barking at the trees. It was like he'd seen something that scared him so bad he'd never be the same again. I've seen scared animals before, bears, coyotes, you name it, but Max's fear was different. He was looking at something we couldn't see. The larger search began the next day. Dozens of volunteers, state police, helicopters flying overhead. We were sure we'd find her, maybe disoriented, lost in the swamp. But as the hours dragged on, I felt a growing sense of dread. Hockomock isn't the kind of place that lets people go easily once it has them. On the third day, we found her sneaker, a white Converse, half buried in the mud, about 2 miles from where her car had been parked. The strange thing was, there weren't any other signs of her. No footprints, no broken branches, no trail that led deeper into the swamp. It was like she'd just vanished. We set up a base camp near where the shoe was found, and for the next few days we scoured that area, pushing deeper into the swamp. That's when things started getting strange. The fog that had rolled in on the first night never left. It clung to the ground, thick and swirling in ways that didn't seem natural. We'd be walking, and out of nowhere, you'd hear someone call your name, but when you'd turn around, there'd be no one there. The other rangers were starting to get spooked. A few volunteers said they saw strange lights in the distance, bluish orbs floating just above the swamp water. At first I thought they were fireflies, but they were too big for that, and they didn't flicker. They just hovered, pulsing gently, before disappearing into the mist. One night, after nearly a week of searching, I was alone on the edge of the swamp, standing near an old, gnarled tree. I'd split off from the group for a few minutes to check a nearby clearing. That's when I heard a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more menacing, like the earth itself was growling at me. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and for just a second, I saw something move between the trees, a tall, shadowy figure, too large to be human, but moving upright like a person. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, watching. I don't scare easily. I've been a ranger for decades, but in that moment I was terrified. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the trees. The growling stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw, not then, at least. Who'd believe me? People were already talking about the lights and the voices, and I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. But I'll tell you this, I've never been back to that part of the swamp since. I refused to lead any more search parties after that night. By the second week, the official search was called off. No one wanted to say it, but we all knew she was gone. People don't just disappear, not like that. But Sandra Howe was gone, swallowed by the swamp, like so many others before her. The strangest thing happened a few weeks after we stopped looking. Sandra's parents came back to the trailhead one last time, just to pay their respects. They left flowers, prayed for their daughter, and as they were leaving, they swore they heard her voice calling out to them from deep in the woods. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but they were sure it was her. They never went back to the swamp again after that. Over the years, I've heard other stories, people seeing figures in the mist, strange lights at night, even more disappearances. But for me, Sandra's case is the one that haunts me the most. You see, I don't think she got lost. I think something took her. Something old, something that's been in those woods longer than any of us. And whatever it is, it's still there, waiting. I've since retired, but I keep my distance from the swamp. I'll drive by sometimes just out of habit, but I never stop. Every now and then, though, I'll see something, just a flash of movement in the trees, a shadow that's too big, too fast. And I'll wonder if it's still out there, looking for its next victim. So if you ever find yourself near the Hockomock Swamp, remember Sandra Howe. And remember this, some places aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be feared. And if you hear something calling your name from the woods, don't answer. The disappearance of Heather Collins, 1994. I've been a park ranger for most of my adult life, and I've seen my fair share of accidents, lost hikers, and strange occurrences in the wilderness. But the case of Heather Collins still unsettles me, even after all these years. It was the summer of 1994 when Heather Collins, a 28-year-old solo hiker from Maine, ventured into the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. She was experienced. She'd hiked trails all over the country. From the start, this wasn't a case of an unprepared hiker making a bad decision. Heather knew what she was doing, and she had meticulously planned her route through the more remote sections of the forest. Heather's trip was supposed to last 5 days. She checked in with the ranger station before setting out, told us her expected return date, and we gave her the usual safety advice. At the time, it was just another routine check-in. 5 days passed, and Heather didn't return. At first, we didn't panic. Hikers sometimes lose track of time or decide to stay out an extra day. But when another day went by with no word from her, we initiated a search. I was part of the search team that headed out on August 18th. The White Mountains are vast, and some areas are extremely remote, with little to no foot traffic. We covered the usual trails first, but as the days went on, we began to fan out into the more isolated parts of the forest, looking for any sign of her. 3 days into the search, one of the teams stumbled across something, a campsite. It was Heather's. Her tent was still pitched, her backpack leaned against a tree, and her belongings were scattered around the site. It looked like she had left in a hurry. We found her sleeping bag, food, and a small notebook she'd been using as a journal. But Heather herself was nowhere to be found. I remember that the first thing that struck me when we arrived at her campsite was the feeling of impropriety. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, but the way everything was left seemed wrong. Her stuff was stacked, but everything looked like she had just left but never came. Then we found her journal. I've read a lot of things in my time, but the entries in that notebook sent a chill down my spine. Heather had been keeping track of her days, jotting down notes about the trail, the weather, and her general thoughts. But it was the last few entries that really stood out. She wrote about feeling uneasy at night, about hearing strange noises outside her tent, footsteps, twigs snapping, like someone was walking around her campsite. She mentioned seeing something, a figure in the distance, just out of the corner of her eye, but every time she looked, it was gone. She wrote that she was sure she wasn't alone in the forest. One entry stood out in particular. I swear I heard someone walking around my tent last night. Twice I called out, but no one answered. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like someone was out there watching. I don't know if I'm being paranoid, but I can't shake this feeling. Another entry from the day before she vanished read, I saw it again today, a shape, moving through the trees. I thought it was another hiker, but it never got close enough for me to see clearly. I waved, but whoever it was didn't wave back. Now I'm wondering if I even saw anyone at all. It's so quiet out here, but I feel like I'm being followed. Her last entry was dated August 16th. It happened again last night. Footsteps, but no one there. I'm leaving in the morning, cutting the trip short. Something's not right. But Heather never left. Whatever had scared her enough to end her trip early had kept her there, or worse, driven her into the wilderness where we couldn't find her. We searched the area around the campsite thoroughly. There were faint signs of tracks, but they were inconclusive, maybe hers, maybe not. No real evidence of foul play, but no sign of an animal attack either. It was as if she'd just walked into the woods and vanished. The journal suggested she wasn't imagining things. Those noises, those shapes in the trees, they were real, or at least real to her. She wasn't the type to spook easily, but something out there had shaken her. We kept searching for days, but nothing turned up. No body, no additional clues. Just her gear, her journal, and a campsite that felt like it was frozen in time. Officially, her disappearance was marked as unsolved, like so many others in these remote places. But I have my own theories. See, this part of the forest is known to be a spot where a few strange things have happened over the years. Solo hikers have gone missing before, though we've usually found them sometimes hurt, sometimes disoriented. But Heather's case, it was different. Her gear, the journal, the noises she described, it was all too human, too real. In my experience, the wilderness can make you feel things, hear things that aren't there. But I also know that sometimes it's not your mind playing tricks on you. Sometimes there is someone out there. And they're watching. I think Heather sensed it, maybe even saw it. I believe she was being watched, and I believe whoever or whatever it was had something to do with her disappearance. It wasn't the forest itself that got her, and it wasn't any supernatural force. It was something human. Whether it was someone lurking out there or a fellow hiker who crossed paths with her, I don't know. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that Heather wasn't alone during those last few nights. Even today, whenever I'm on that part of the trail, I think about her. I think about the fear she must have felt, writing those last entries in her journal, hearing those footsteps outside her tent. I've walked those same paths, and sometimes I get that same feeling, the one she described. Like you're not alone out there. Like someone's watching from just beyond the tree line. Some stories don't have a clear ending. Heather Collins' story is one of those. We never found her, and I'm not sure we ever will. But every time I think about that empty tent, her journal, and those last frightened words she wrote, I can't help but wonder who or what was out there that night. The disappearance of Elizabeth Parks, 1987. I've been a park ranger for nearly 30 years, and I've seen my share of accidents and rescues. But some things stick with you, things you can't explain. The disappearance of Elizabeth Parks is one of those stories. It was late August 1987 when Elizabeth, a 32-year-old woman from New York, came to hike the Appalachian Trail. She'd been on her own, a seasoned solo hiker who knew the trails well. She'd told friends and family she was planning a week-long trek, camping along the way, and she'd even checked in at the ranger station before heading into the woods. At the time, it seemed like just another routine hike. Elizabeth was prepared, had the right gear, and looked confident. Nothing about her stood out as a problem. But something went wrong. Elizabeth was last seen on August 23rd near one of the trail shelters around mid-afternoon. A couple of other hikers reported chatting with her briefly. She'd seemed in good spirits and was heading deeper into the forest, toward a more remote section of the trail. No one thought twice about it. A few days passed and no one heard from her. At first, her family didn't panic. It wasn't unusual for solo hikers to lose phone signal or extend their trip by a day or two. But when Elizabeth missed her return date and didn't check in with anyone, we got the call. By August 29th, search teams were deployed. Helicopters circled overhead, volunteers combed through the dense woods, and we worked around the clock. We covered miles of rugged terrain, checked every shelter, every side trail, and every campsite. But it was as if Elizabeth had vanished into thin air. I remember the second week of the search distinctly. It was hot, humid, and exhausting. By then, hope was starting to fade. People were tired and frustrated, but we kept pushing. Then we found something, a single boot, stuck in the mud, far off the main trail. It matched the description of Elizabeth's gear. I led a small team deeper into the forest from where the boot was found. The woods were thick and disorienting. In some places it felt like we were walking in circles, with the trees so dense they blocked out the sunlight. We were miles off the trail, in an area that no one had any reason to be in. That's when things started to get strange. The deeper we went, the more we felt off. I can't explain it exactly. It was like the forest itself was watching us. The air was heavy, and there was this unnatural stillness. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just silence. One of the guys on my team, a veteran ranger who'd been on dozens of searches, even commented on it. He said it felt like we were being followed. We all felt it. At one point I thought I heard something. A voice, maybe. It was faint, carried on the wind, if you could even call it wind, because the air was so still. We stopped and listened, but it was gone. We called out for Elizabeth, but no one answered. Hours passed, and the sense of unease grew. We eventually had to turn back as night was falling. I don't know what it was about that area, but none of us were eager to spend the night there. We marked the spot where we found the boot and came back the next morning with more people. But after that, the trail went cold. There were no more signs, no more clues. The search officially lasted for weeks, but we never found Elizabeth. No body, no campsite, nothing but that single boot, stuck in the mud miles away from where she should have been. Her disappearance was ruled as unsolved, and it became another one of those cases that haunt us. Now, I've heard stories over the years. People talk about strange things happening in the deep woods, about hikers who vanish without a trace, about places where compasses don't work, and about weird lights in the sky. I'm not a superstitious man, but after what happened with Elizabeth, I started to wonder. It's not just the wild animals and the rough terrain you have to worry about out here. Sometimes it feels like the forest itself is hiding something. It's been more than 30 years since Elizabeth disappeared, but I still think about her every time I'm out on the trail. It's a reminder that no matter how prepared you are, the wilderness is unpredictable. And sometimes it doesn't give people back.